Chapter 10, The Aftermath, Antony's POV. Antony felt wonderful when he woke up. Perhaps that was the biggest difference between overindulging in blood and the long-ago days when he'd drink himself into oblivion on the sweet wines and thick beers and heady golden meads of his homeland. Instead of feeling weak and sick the morning after a feast, he felt powerful and alert and ready to do just about anything. Well, the afternoon after. Late afternoon, probably. They had returned to the ship dangerously close to dawn, and no doubt by the time he and Hanyu went to bed it had been well into the morning. He glanced down at the cot next to his bed. It was a little strange to have someone there again. He'd always kept his offerings in his bedchamber, if only for convenience sake, but for centuries now it had felt no different than keeping his chair or his wardrobe in here with him. Hanyu was no chair. He'd snored through the night again, and Antony had discovered that an immediate benefit of having him close was that he could simply kick him awake when the snores got too loud. There were doubtless other benefits, but Antony couldn't think of them through his haze of unease he felt with the boy so near him. He didn't know why exactly, but it felt dangerous to look down and see Hanyu tangled in his blanket, bare limbs flung everywhere and his face soft and foolish with sleep. Antony wished he hadn't agreed to let the boy move his cot in here, but it was too late now. He knew better than to offer open-ended rewards. He hadn't made such a mistake in centuries, blood-drunk or not. But he'd been genuinely moved as well as amused by the boy's panic rush to save him. The raw terror in his offering's voice and the relief that had flooded over his face when Antony had sputtered out of the water alive, it had all made Antony feel as if he should give something in return for such intense feelings. And, if he was being honest with himself, he didn't know for sure whether he could turn Hanyu down if he asked that way again, his voice so soft and desperate and choked with tears. Anyhow, the boy had been elated. He'd actually sobbed with happiness as he arranged his blankets and pillows, stopping for occasional overjoyed, if watery, grins up at Antony. Those grins hadn't been nearly as annoying as they should have been. At least he hadn't given the boy everything he wanted. The invitation in Hanyu's eyes and movements, and his bulging erection, of course, had been as blatant as it could be without a verbal request, and frankly, it had been a little more tempting than he would have expected. Luckily, he'd worn himself out first with Marcus, and Felix, and Julia, and Hilaria, and maybe Thaddeus, if he remembered correctly. He slid out of bed and got dressed, then stepped carefully around Hanyu to get into his sitting room. He settled at his desk, pulled out a locked box, and carefully twisted in the code. When it sprang open, he glanced worriedly at one of the 2 sheets of paper the box held, then pulled out the other. It was hardly even paper, vellum more like. A relic. Detrius left over from another age, just like the spell laid on it. Antony spread it on his desk, pulled out a pen, and began writing. Dearest Claudia, I apologize for my long silence. We just had our visit to Taisha, and the king wanted some raiders in the south taken care of, so we handled that last night. Marcus caught a disguised woman among the soldiers and is planning to give her to Theodora as a present. I'm not sure whether I should have allowed it, if I'm being honest. There are plenty of others on the ship who would want a woman, and there are already grumblings about the way I let Theodora keep all her old offerings to herself instead of releasing them to general service. She's much too valuable, and terrifying, to risk angering, but this might have been a step too far. My own new offering is a funny one. His name is Hanyu. He blurted it at me in the midst of a whole avalanche of panicked babbling. That'll teach me to take from the back row. But he's got lovely golden hair and should be wonderful to paint. I do still wonder whether the educational standards at the temple have gone down in recent years. Have you had any trouble in that regard? Nevertheless, his blood is excellent, and it will be an amusing 6 years, if nothing else. Have you heard from Titus recently? None of my letters have elicited any reply for almost 2 weeks now, and I'm getting rather worried. I know he had accidentally killed one of his 2 remaining elves. Do you know if he managed to capture another? If not, we could arrange a meeting. I have 4 at the moment, and I would be more than happy to give him one if he's still down to just one of his own. We shouldn't waste any time working out the details. I hope all is well with you. I miss you badly as of late, and hope to hear from you soon. The summit feels very far away today. Your affectionate brother, Antony. Antony watched the letters fade into the vellum, then picked up the other sheet. He knew it was probably pointless, but he had to do something, and writing letters on this damned enchanted paper was all he could do. He retrieved his pen. Dear Titus, write back, you idiot. You're scaring me to death. I have an elf to give to you. Just send me your coordinates, and Theodora will have us there before you know it. Please reply. Your brother, Antony. He stared at the vellum for a long time after his own message faded. Several times he started to put it away, but he always hesitated. What if he locked the box and then Titus wrote back 5 minutes later? Damn his idiot brother and his damned idiot impulsiveness. Why was he always so wasteful about blood? It was bad enough that he was so lavish with his humans, but why couldn't he at least be careful with elves? He knew what would happen if he and his crew couldn't get any elf blood for too long. Why was he so reckless? Antony's dour thoughts were interrupted by a tentative knock at his door. The boy's breakfast had arrived. It must be nearly sundown. He stretched and put his papers back in the box, then snapped the lock shut and put it back in his drawer. The knock came again, even softer than before. Antony was almost sure that it wasn't going to wake his snoring offering. He went to the door himself. The attendant who stood on the doorstep paled when he saw Antony. He dropped hastily to his knees, set the tray carefully on the floor, then bent forward into a full bow. "My lord," he stammered, "please forgive me for disturbing you." The man's face and voice were familiar. It was his personal attendant from the last cycle. Antony felt a rush of awkwardness, perhaps. It had been a long time since he'd felt awkward, but he felt suddenly that it was awkward to have his former offering delivering his new offering's meal, and that he ought to remember the man's name. "Not at all," he said hastily. "I was awake." He hesitated. His instinct was to simply take the tray and go, but he felt like he really ought to say something more. "You are settling well into general service, then?" "Yes, my lord." The man sounded confused and a little guarded. "Lord Felix has been kind enough to take me into his protection." After the new crop of offerings arrived, those left over from the last cycle usually tried to attach themselves to one of the vampires who wasn't high-ranking enough to have their own official personal attendant. It was a less formal version of Antony and Hanyu's arrangement, where the human offered blood, service, and usually sex in exchange for protection from the other vampires on the ship. Antony would have estimated that 2/3 of the disputes he mediated involved these arrangements. At least his former offering had done well for himself. Antony doubted he'd see this man at the center of such a dispute any time soon. No one with a lick of sense would interfere with a human under Felix's protection. Felix was Marcus's second and one of the finest warriors on the entire ship. Despite all that, he was ridiculously kind and soft-hearted, and Antony couldn't imagine him being harsh to anybody. Felix also had a lovely long cock that curved deliciously to the left when it was hard, something Antony had been reminded of most delightfully last night. Yes, his former offering was in a very nice situation indeed. "I'm glad to hear that," he said, and he meant it. The man had served him faithfully for 6 years. He had been humble and unobtrusive and graceful and perfect, and Antony really did wish he'd bothered to learn his name. "It's good to see you again." Antony stooped to retrieve the tray, then stepped back behind the door and shut it. Perhaps he ought to wake Hanyu, he thought, as he set the tray on the table. Then again, the boy deserved a rest after the terror Antony had inflicted on him last night. He felt squirmingly uncomfortable when he remembered the fear in those wide brown eyes as Antony had loomed in his face, or the way the boy's whole body had trembled when he'd been folding Antony's blood-soaked clothes. He felt the same way in the moment and had been surprised at how much he disliked the sensation. He had never gotten enjoyment from causing fear or pain, outside of a little bedroom play. Even in battle, he didn't like the idea of making someone's last moments worse than they had to be, and when it came to his offerings, well, it was irritating to share your space with someone who goggled at you like you were some kind of dragon. But a little justified apprehension didn't usually bother him this much, and certainly not in the middle of a blood haze. He felt as if he'd lost something. Not something terribly big or important, but it naggled. He supposed that he would rather miss Hanyu's untroubled greetings and smiles, annoying as they had been at first. It had been nice to have someone greet him with genuine excitement when he got home. He left the tray where it was and drifted back into the bedchamber, where he stepped around to the snoring boy and settled in his chair with a book. He had a lot to keep his mind off today. Hanyu's POV. Hanyu woke a few times in the night with Lord Antony's foot prodding at him. "Roll over, or whatever it is you do to stop snoring," the god had demanded, his voice thick with sleep. Through his own exhaustion, Hanyu had muttered an apology and complied, slipping immediately back into his dreams. When he truly woke, though, he thought back and smiled at how sleepy Lord Antony had sounded. His master must have been nothing short of exhausted. Hanyu stretched, luxuriating in his new location. The god's bed loomed over him, obstructing his view of most of the room, but he didn't care if he couldn't see it. He was in it, and that was all that mattered. "I see you're finally awake." Lord Antony's voice came from the other side of the room. Hanyu sat up, then stood to look over the bed. His god was seated in a soft chair next to one of the several tall bookshelves, and he held a book in his lap. He was looking intently up at Hanyu, a finger marking a spot on the page. Hanyu wasn't sure what to do. Before, it was natural to fall into his bow when Lord Antony came out into the sitting room, but now the god was looking right at him, and it seemed rude to drop down to the carpet where Lord Antony couldn't see him anymore. "Your breakfast is on the table," Lord Antony said, still peering at him. "It's probably cold by now." "Oh." Someday, Hanyu vowed to himself, he would wake up when the attendant knocked on the door. "Sorry, my lord." "I'm not the one who has to eat it," the god replied. He set his book aside and got up, much to Hanyu's surprise. Apparently, Lord Antony planned to follow him into the sitting room. He resolved his dilemma with a quick, clumsy bow, then turned to the door. He headed straight for the table, but his master cleared his throat loudly behind him. "Put some clothes on, boy," Lord Antony ordered. "We talked about this." "Oh!" Hanyu flushed. "Right. Sorry, my lord." He dressed quickly, then sat down to his meal. Hot cakes, sprinkled lavishly with sugar and drizzled in molasses. The kitchens must have wanted to provide all the offerings with a particularly nice meal after the gods had been so strange and threatening last night. Hanyu hoped that all his friends were all right. The food was indeed cold, but it was still good, and he happily tucked in. Lord Antony had folded into one of the other chairs, and he went on looking at Hanyu, who squirmed a little under his intent gaze. He didn't think the god had ever kept his attention on him for so long before. "Are you all right?" Lord Antony finally asked. Then, at Hanyu's confused look, "After last night, I mean." "Oh!" Hanyu felt warmth bloom in his belly. The god was worried about him. "Of course, my lord," he rushed to assure his master. Lord Antony didn't look satisfied. "You were very frightened. I'm sorry for that, Hanyu." The words sounded awkward and unpracticed. Hanyu was astonished. Why was Lord Antony, Lord of the Gods, apologizing to him? It felt surreal. He had to work to keep his jaw from sagging open and revealing a mouthful of hot cake. "If I could do things over, I would send you to bed and handle my clothes and bath myself," the god continued, his tone brisk and almost annoyed again. "You won't have to touch my soiled things again. I'll leave them in the washroom tonight and give them to an attendant myself when you go to the upper deck in the morning." Hanyu swallowed hard, both to get his food down and to keep the lump out of his throat. He didn't know when he'd been so touched by an offer. "There's no need for that, my lord," he said softly. "I live to serve you. I was honored to attend you, and I'll be happy to take care of your clothes." "I imagine happy is overstating it a bit," the god snapped. "All right, then. I don't mind." Hanyu knew it was improper, but he strained to catch Lord Antony's eye. He wanted his master to see his sincerity. "Truly, my lord, it's all right. I know that my people live peacefully because of your protection from the desert savages. I'm grateful." Lord Antony stood. "Don't be contrary. I'm going out now, and when I return, I expect things in the washroom to look exactly the same as they do now." Hanyu bowed his head in acquiescence. He wasn't afraid of the way he'd been last night, but that didn't mean he was interested in disobeying direct orders. Especially when he thought of that small, forced apology. Lord Antony was breaking habits for him, he was almost certain. Who knew? Perhaps he'd be able to convince his master to break other habits, too.